Hvala Jezus, lepo pozdravljeni na našem spletnem portalu Tomist, ki je namenjen vsakovrstnim vprašanjem v zvezi s tomizmom. Gre za slovenski portal, ki je namenjen širjenju poznavanja tomizma v slovenskem prostoru, vendar bo tokrat oddaja v angleščini, saj pri njem sodeluje naš ugledni gost, s katerim se bova pogovarjala torej v angleškem jeziku. So, welcome to our YouTube channel Tomist, where we discuss all sorts of Thomistic questions. I am Ivo Krže, your host. Usually our podcasts are in Slovene, but today we have the honor to be joined by an eminent scholar in Thomism, Father Stephen Louis Brock. Stephen, thank you for having joined us on our tiny YouTube channel in this somehow remote part of Europe, Slovenia, that is, I guess, quite unknown to American people.
Not totally. No, but thank you very much, Ivo. It's a real pleasure to be here, to have a live conversation with you, finally. It's a real pleasure.
I'm very grateful to Steve for our for our correspondence that is lasting for years, and is really helpful to me to discuss with you all sorts of Thomistic questions.
For me too. I learned many things. Yeah.
So, and we are the first time in a let's say live contact, and this is for me really an exciting moment. So,
great.
Stephen Brock is priest of the prelature of Opus Dei, was ordained in 1992. He is ordinary professor for medieval philosophy at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, Santa Croce, and is presently visiting professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago. Among other academic titles, he is also ordinary member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. His many works are all focused on the thought of St. Thomas, and particularly on his metaphysics and his practical philosophy, with a special accent on the Aristotelian character of his thought, hence the title of our podcast, Aquinas the Aristotelian. So, Stephen, you are not just working in Chicago, Illinois, but you are also originally from this state, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, that's correct.
The new Pope, the first American Pope in history, also comes from Illinois. So I guess that you are quite proud of this fact.
Oh, it's very exciting. It's very exciting. Yeah, he was born maybe 60 miles, 100 kilometers from my hometown, you know. So that's very exciting. And as people here know, he is also, it's been documented, he is a fan of the Chicago White Sox baseball team. And I have always been a fan of the White Sox. So that's another connection.
I've heard this thing, but I have the impression that it's quite important for if someone is from Chicago or Illinois, if he is or is not a White Sox fan.
Yeah, it's White Sox, and there are two teams. There are two teams, White Sox and Cubs, and they are great rivals. So,
and what are let's say not the theological or philosophical, but are there any implications, let's say, of being a White Sox fan?
Well, right now they're suffering a lot because the team is not very good, right? But the White Sox are on the south side of Chicago, which is more kind of working class, right? And whereas the Cubs are on the north side, which is sort of upper middle class. So there's a social difference. I think you can say in general, yeah.
I used to play baseball when I was a child.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and I tried to play it also with my kids, but here in Slovenia there are no teams, so we are just playing on let's say on the grass.
It's less popular here now, you know.
Really?
The young people now they love soccer. They play soccer here.
Much more like in Italy, let's say.
Yes, it's
really
striking. Yeah. It's quite striking.
Right, it's a pity. I like baseball very much. It's a great sport. Well, today we are going to talk with Stephen, not about baseball, sadly, but about the Aristotelian character of Thomistic philosophy and Thomistic metaphysics in particular. But before we begin, may I ask you, Stephen, to start with the prayer?
Sure, let's do that. Sure, maybe we can pray to the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, Lord, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. O God, who by the light of the Holy Spirit have instructed the hearts of your faithful, grant by the same Spirit that we may be wise in what is right and ever rejoice in his divine consolation. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Good.
Thank you, Steve, for this prayer for wisdom, because I think that the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas somehow requires, let's say, a prayerful approach, because it's so complicated. It seems simple at the surface, but when you get deeply into his thought, it's really an intricate thing.
It's very complicated. Yeah, it's deceptively simple. His writing is so clear, isn't it? And my students find that. They think, well, I understood everything. My students say, but then when they try to reproduce it, they get confused because it's
I saw it in our correspondence. Many passages from St. Thomas seem to me just that they clearly say this or that, but when you showed me some distinctions behind, no, I realized that this is really a great thing to understand St. Thomas, and this YouTube channel is devoted to this. You have to know, if there are also listeners or viewers from other parts of the world, we don't have much Thomism in Slovenia, sadly. We had a quite strong Thomistic tradition, let's say, till the end of the Second World War, maybe also till, let's say, the times of the Second Vatican Council and so on. But after basically this, we have basically no teacher at our faculty of theology that identifies himself as a Thomist, sadly.
I see. Well,
so we are trying to somehow to revitalize this tradition.
Well, good for you. It's very important. I think that's a great project of yours.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So we could start, Steve, with a look, maybe, if we are talking about Aquinas, the Aristotelian character of St. Thomas Aquinas and his thought, his metaphysics, especially. Maybe we could start with a short look at the different recent interpretations given to the Metaphysics of St. Thomas. Not all of them share the conviction that his metaphysics is an Aristotelian one. In fact, nowadays, many interpretations seem to stress the Platonic side of Thomas's metaphysics. Why is it so?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's very true that for some decades now, interpreters of St. Thomas have stressed or emphasized the Platonic side of his thought. I think if going back even to the 1950s, you had figures like Cornelio Fabro, right, Louis Bertrand Geiger, R.J. Henley, right? And recently, that trend continues. There's writers in English like Wayne Hankey and Fran O'Rourke. There's an expert in Neoplatonism, in the history of Neoplatonism, named Eric Pearl, who is fairly well known here in the English-speaking world. I mention him because he's a very staunch Neoplatonist, and in one of his recent writings, he mentioned me briefly he's talking about St. Thomas, and he mentions how people are stressing the Platonic side of St. Thomas, and he said that even I, who am an anti-Platonic Thomist, he called me anti-Platonic, right?
Okay.
I acknowledge that.
Okay.
Well, I don't consider myself anti-Platonic. Let's say. I don't accept that. I think it's clear, it's obvious that Thomas took Platonic thought very seriously, okay? And his notion, in particular in his metaphysics, his concept of esse, of being, and the actus essendi, and also the very idea of the first principle of God as ipsum esse subsistens, that there's a Neoplatonic background for that. There's no question about that. It's clear in the sources. He was drawing upon Boethius, who is usually considered a Neoplatonist, right? He was drawing upon the Pseudo-Dionysius, Proclus, and also Avicenna, who has a very strong Neoplatonic dimension to his thought. And I have no wish to deny those sources. But what I have wanted to stress, and I think it's true, it's true that my own formation was more Aristotelian. That's also true. So maybe I'm a little bit prejudiced. I don't know. That may be true. But I think it can be shown that St. Thomas was very careful in his presentation of the doctrine of being to keep it consistent with Aristotle's philosophy, right? He wants to be consistent with Aristotle's metaphysics, right? And Aristotle's own understanding of the nature of being. Personally, I think that St. Thomas, if anything, he was inspired maybe by Boethius. Boethius famously claims that Plato and Aristotle are perfectly in harmony, right? At least about the most important things. And I think St. Thomas was inspired by that. But I think he succeeds in preserving a kind of a fundamentally Aristotelian outlook, right? While integrating these Neoplatonic ideas into that outlook.
Yes. How would you say that? But if we take for example his understanding that you mentioned, the understanding of esse, of being as, let's say, existence. Could we trace, let's say, a boundary between the Platonic element, the Platonic heritage that is present in this concept and the Aristotelian, or is simply because you stress quite a lot and also Professor Berti, perhaps the major scholar of Aristotle in Italy. I actually came to know you in an indirect manner, reading a text from Professor Berti that was about the Aristotelian, as a kind of a revival of Aristotelian Thomism, and he mentioned you in a very, let's say, he stressed your role in this kind of a revival, and his point was that an Aristotelian concept of being was somehow not compatible with the concept of ipsum esse subsistence, because the concept of ipsum esse subsistence is of a Neoplatonic origin that does not, let's say, include the multiplicity of being, the analogical nature of being, and because it's bound to this Platonic, Neoplatonic, let's say, univocity, unitary understanding of being that leaves no room basically for a multitude in itself, and also in, let's say, in reality. So how can we say that with Boethius, that you, as you mentioned, that at the level of the concept of being, these two heritages in St. Thomas are, let's say, compatible? Are they compatible? Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, this is very difficult, right? It's a very difficult topic, and it's complicated.
Yes.
And it's true that I think Professor Berti, who was a great philosopher, a great philosopher, a great Aristotelian, one of the most important of the last few decades, a great scholar, a great teacher. He was also a real gentleman. He was a wonderful man. I think he had a very serious point. And if you look at the sources, especially there is a manuscript, a commentary, an anonymous commentary. They're not sure who wrote it. Pierre Hadot, the great scholar of ancient philosophy, he attributes it to Porphyry, right? The kind of the anti-Christian follower of Plotinus, Porphyry. He attributes this commentary on Plato's Parmenides to Porphyry, and there it is very clear that there's the kind of the hierarchy of being that you have in Neoplatonism, right? But at the culmination, at the top, right, you go from material things, right, which are composites of matter and form and being, right? And then you rise up to pure forms, right, without matter, but they're still composed of form and being. They participate in being, right? And then at the top is pure being, pure ani. The one is pure ani, right? Without form, without matter, and without form. Okay? And it's a single subsisting entity, which is the source of all reality, right? And if you think of it that way, if you think of being in that way, then you do have the problems, I think, that Professor Berti identified from an Aristotelian point of view. I think it's absolutely right. Because it ends up. Well, go ahead.
Excuse me, but you somehow disagree with Berti on this
I
point.
disagree with Berti. What I disagree with is that this is the right way to read St. Thomas. Okay. I agree with him that if that's the correct reading of St. Thomas, and in fact, for many people it is, right? Then there's a real problem. Just what you say, that it makes esse being one single nature, one sort of autonomous nature, which exists by itself, and then other things participate in that nature, all the beings, okay, in greater or lesser degrees of intensity or more or less perfect modes, right? But for Aristotle, no, being is many from the start. It has many meanings. It's kind of a multiplicity of natures which have an analogical unity. There's a primary nature, but you can't collapse them into one, right? Because the nature of esse for anything is a function of what it's the esse of, right? So that, and St. Thomas draws often on, Aristotle says in the De Anima that for a living thing, to be is to be alive, is life, right? That's being in one sense, right? Well, for a non-living thing, being is not life, right? It's something else, right? So it's different for different things, and it doesn't have an autonomous identity. And then the other problem, as the other problem is if we understand the divine nature that way, that the divine nature is the nature of esse, kind of pulled out from things and made separate. It's the Platonic kind of move is called ecthesis, kind of positing outside, right? And well, then the divine nature is not essentially different from things what you find in other beings, right? They share somehow in the divine nature. They would have something of God's own nature in them, right? And of course,
So
that's a kind, almost a kind of pantheism, which St. Thomas would certainly reject, and Aristotle too.
yes, you just answered to the question I wanted to pose. I mean, there is a latent, so we could say, following, let's say, Berti's interpretation of Platonism also, that in Platonism there is a latent pantheism
Yes.
that is basically because Plato and the Neoplatonics inherit the understanding of esse, of being, that comes from Parmenides.
That's right. That's right. It goes back to Parmenides in a way. Right?
It
Being is
goes
one
back.
thing. Yeah, and that's the Aristotle's criticism of Parmenides, is that he thinks of being univocally as one nature. And Plato, of course, Plato tries to save the multiplicity of beings against Parmenides, right?
Yeah.
But he does it by, at least from Aristotle's point of view, he does it by mixing being and non-being. That non-being would be the source of the multiplicity of things, or privation, or matter, but a matter understood as. And Aristotle's criticism, and this was for me, this was the point that was really fundamental. And it was Professor Berti who made me understand it, was that the differences among the beings, right, and what makes possible a multiplicity of beings, the differences are also beings. They can't be non-beings. Non-being doesn't differentiate anything. Right? I think if you understand that point in Aristotle's metaphysics, you have understood about half of his metaphysics, I think. Right? It's really fundamental.
Yeah.
A difficult point, but it's really crucial. And I think Thomas is very sensitive to that point, that very point. That the different, he shows up in many places in his thought.
Well, but Steve, there now we have, let's say, at this point, the problem that you are trying to solve in your texts about this topic, how to harmonize these two aspects.
Yeah.
The ipsum esse, the participational character of esse that is taken from from Platonism,
Right.
on one side, and on the other side, this Aristotelic denial that being can be somehow, let's say, he made as a hypostasis, as
Right.
substance, something autonomous, as an
Something
autonomous nature. Yeah.
Yes.
How
Right.
how to harmonize these two aspects?
Okay. Well, I think there's two things, and this is what I've tried to answer Professor Berti with kind of two basic points fundamentally. First of all, very crucial is simply to stop and consider what exactly is essay for Thomas. What does that mean? What is essay? Okay? What is and sometimes he uses this expression, the nature of essay, natura essendi. Right? In one place, he even speaks in his commentary on Boethius, on the De Hebdomadibus, he speaks of the essence of essay, right? Which is a funny expression, right? But what is essay? Well, it's very clear, and he says it many times. It's the actuality of an essence. Essay that's what it means, the actuality of an essence. So it's always in connection with an essence. Right? You can never, if you try to separate essay from essence, it disappears. Right? It's not even, it's not separable, it's not even intelligible. without an essence, and especially without form. You can have essay without matter. And he says all essay is understood through a form. So the idea of essay without form is, for Thomas, it's like the idea of prime matter without form. It's just incoherent. It makes no sense. Right?
Okay.
So you need to have this connection first. And then, because the forms of things are many and diverse, right? Well, the essence, the actuality of the forms is likewise diverse, right? And it's diverse not just more and less, in a quantitative way, right? It's also more and less perfect, of course. There are more perfect instances of essay and less perfect, right? But what essay is different for different things. And Thomas says that. Esse est diversum in diversis, he says. It's diverse in diverse things. What essay is different, right? As I was saying before about life and not life, right? For living things or non-living things. So that's the first point. Then I think if we turn to the really crucial question, which is how to understand God, right? And of course, Thomas will say many times, God is a subsistent essay. But what we can't think of is just taking sort of the common concept of essay, and this is the kind of the Platonic move, right? Take that, kind of indeterminate essay, not a function of any particular form, and then posit that's kind of up there as separate, right? That doesn't work. That's not how Thomas proceeds, right? I'm sure of that for him, the essay of God is not just indeterminate essay. It's quite determinate. In fact, Thomas, he doesn't say that very often, but he does say that God is a determinate entity. He's not finite. He's not limited. Okay? He's infinite, but he is definitely himself and nothing else. Right? He has his own identity. Okay?
Yeah, and he has his own essence, because
and he has his own essence. Yes.
there are tendencies in this Gilsonian interpretation of St. Thomas to think of God as devoid of essence.
Yes, that's a strong tendency. Gilson knew that Thomas speaks of God's essence, and he admits it, but he's reluctant about it, right? He does, and there are others who say that when Thomas, and there are more recent interpreters, Jean-Luc Marion, for example, right? He says that when Thomas says that God's essence is essay, he really means God has no essence. There's no such thing as what God is, right? Which I think for Thomas would mean there's no such thing as God. Right? It would mean that, But that's what they tend to say, right? This is what they tend to say. So, but what you have to say then is that what God is not the same thing as what essay in general is. God is identical with the essay of God. He and his essay are the same, right? And that's only true of God. No other thing is identical with its own essay. You are not identical with your essay. I am not identical with my essay, your life, my life. We have essay. We have our essay. God is his essay. But his essay is not just essay by itself. That doesn't make any sense. So his essay, put it this way, his essay, what he is and what his essay is are the same, but we haven't said what he is when we say essay. That doesn't tell us what he is. It's a mystery what he is. So we don't know what he is. Right?
Okay. So you connect this with the question of let's say that our knowledge of our insight in God's essence is a supernatural act. that
Yes,
waits
yes,
us
absolutely. Yes.
in heaven
Yeah.
if we
Yes,
come.
absolutely. We can't say, even Thomas has a remarkable passage
Okay. Mm-hmm.
when precisely it's in question 12 of the first part of the Summa, which is about our knowledge of
Mm-hmm.
God, and it's mostly about the possibility of knowing the divine essence in
Yeah.
heaven.
Mm-hmm.
He says, he raises the question, can the divine essence be known through a likeness, through what he calls an intelligible species? We know most things through, we have a likeness of them in our minds, right? So we have a likeness. If you know what a hippopotamus is, you have a likeness of the hippopotamus in your mind. Okay. He says it's impossible to know God through a likeness, know his essence through a likeness. There is no likeness, no form other than God himself, which represents God as he is in himself. And Thomas gives some examples. He says, for example, wisdom or power or essay itself. He says that essay itself does not represent what God is. We understand essay. We know what essay is. We have a concept of this, but we don't have the concept of the divine nature.
This seems very interesting to me because very often I hear this existential kind of interpretation of St. Thomas that is presented in a way as in a manner as to safeguard the transcendence of God.
Yeah,
In the sense that we know essences, but essay is something, like in Martin Heidegger, let's say
yeah,
Sein is
yeah,
something we don't know, we cannot say what it is, because if we say something, we are always speaking about some being or essence or so. And
right.
so, and when we say, I suppose that Jean-Luc Marion is thinking, that was mentioned before, is thinking in a similar way, that
Yes,
when we say God is being, is essays, we are simply denying in an apophatic way any property of God. But
yes.
it is interesting that this your interpretation that focuses on the essence of God safeguards, as you presented before, the transcendence of our knowledge of God's essence.
I think that's the point.
Yeah,
I think this account, it's clearly not pantheistic, right? It really does show the divine transcendence, right? The divine transcendence, even of essay itself. God, in a way, for Thomas, is beyond being itself, beyond the nature of essay. His nature is higher than, which is quite striking, right? That sounds kind of Platonic too, doesn't it? That
yeah, really, yeah, yeah,
beyond being, but not in the way the Platonists
yeah.
say. It's not just beyond substance; it's beyond even the actus essendi. It's high, and he
But it's
says,
not. Excuse me. But it's not beyond essence.
"No, no, he has no. That's right. That's
Yeah,
right. He has essence. Although it's, in a sense, he's beyond every concept we have, including the concept of essence. So it's more than that. It includes the difficulty, of course, is if you say that God is beyond being, it sounds as though he's not a being. And of
yeah.
course he is. He is a being. He
Mm,
exists.
mm,
Right? We can't say that. Um, and in the same way, if it say that he's beyond essence, it sounds like he doesn't have an essence. In fact, he has more essence than anyone. He's has
uh,
essence. This is already clear in the De Ente et Essentia, that early work of St. Thomas. He
uh,
talks about things that have essence in a more or less noble way, right? You have
mhm,
accidents would have it in a very partial way,
mhm,
material things in a very limited way. And you go up the scale, they have essence in a higher and more noble way. And God is at the top of it. He has essence in a higher way. But it's as though all of these concepts that we have, they're somehow contained in the reality of God, but it goes beyond that. The reality of God goes beyond that and is the cause of that. Okay? And all of these are kind of deficient, and he uses that language, deficient representations of the reality of God. Okay?
But still analogous.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
still analogous.
But still analogous. That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. That's absolutely right. But I think the important thing is from the point of view of what those names signify, the most proper signification is the signification that belongs to God, right? And not to creatures. Because I say that because, for example, the philosopher that I mentioned previously, Eric Pearl, he criticizes my stressing that for St. Thomas, God has a form. Thomas says that many times. God is a form, is a simple form, is a form to the highest degree. And Pearl says that I haven't understood that he's using the word analogously, the word form. I think I have understood that, but that means that God is formed to the highest degree, right? Because whenever there's an analogy, and the word is said not by metaphor, but by analogy, and is said properly of creatures and God, it's said primarily of God, and most properly.
So this would be in the kind of analogy that we usually name as the analogy of attribution.
Yes, that's
in the
right.
sense that we have a primary, let's say, sense, and then the others that are somehow said in a secundum quid, no?
Yes, in a derivative way or in a secondary way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly.
Well, Steve, you mentioned many times now the concept of form. I have the impression, reading your book here, I have it, the Percorsi di Sapienza Naturale. This is in Italian. You've taught a lot of time at Santa Croce. So in this book, this is a kind of compendium of your thought. May we say so?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, perhaps so.
It would be how to translate the title Journeys of Natural Wisdom.
Yeah, journeys or paths of natural wisdom. Yeah.
Okay.
Something like that.
In the central part of this book, I find a very strong stress on the concept of form that you mentioned also now in our discussion. And I was wondering if it's somehow connected, because the recent interpretations of St. Thomas Aquinas are not all in this Neoplatonic mode, but you have also strong Aristotelian interpretations, and one of the maybe best known Aristotelian interpreters of St. Thomas recent is the late Professor Lawrence Dewan, that was also your teacher. And he also stressed very much the concept of form. I remember his book, Form and Being.
Yes.
And are you stressing? Are you considering form in a similar manner to him? And why are you stressing form so much?
Yes. Yes, I certainly am. Yes, as you said, he was my teacher. I learned a great deal about St. Thomas's metaphysics from him, and I always recommend him. I think you can learn a lot about St. Thomas's metaphysics from the writings of Lawrence Dewan. And he helped me very much to understand that the centrality of form, not to the detriment of essay, but for a proper understanding of the primacy of essay. Essay is primary. It's the actuality of all acts, right? And the actuality of all forms. And Thomas is very clear about that. But the question is how to understand that, right? How are we supposed to understand that? And very often, I think you find that people, understandably, they kind of think of it as, well, we have matter and form, you know, and matter is potency and form is act, right? And in an analogous way, and St. Thomas will say that essences and even pure forms are potency with respect to esse. So they see this analogy here. It's a proportionality, right? A different analogy. Right? Matter is to form as form is to esse, and they are led to think of the relationship as exactly the same. And it's not the same. This is what I learned very much from Duan. It's not the same relationship. It's similar in that there's a relation of potency and act, but it's a very different kind of potency act relationship, right? So that first of all, you can have form without matter. Matter and form are separable, right?
Okay.
And even the same bit of matter can lose one form and take on another form. Okay. So you can have the matter without the form, and then you can have beings which are pure forms without matter at all. Yeah. Well, Thomas is very clear in both of those things. If you have a form with its esse, that form is completely inseparable from its esse. It can't lose that esse and take on another esse. It's not potency for that esse in the same way. And it always has that esse. And this is his argument, for example, for the immortality of the soul. The soul is a pure form. It can't lose its esse. It's just a form. It can't be separated from its esse.
Okay.
And as I was saying before, you can't have esse without form. Okay. As you can have form without matter, but you can't have esse without form. Form is the actuality of esse. That's what it is. So this means that you can say, you shouldn't say that matter is cause of form. Matter doesn't cause form. Right? Some forms depend upon matter. Right? Some forms. Right? They can't exist without the form of an elephant. Right? Cannot exist without matter. Imagine an immaterial elephant. That would be very strange. Okay? But you can say, and Thomas says it hundreds of times, I don't know how many times, form is cause of being. In fact, he calls it the proper cause of being. Right? The immediate in anything, the immediate cause of its being is its form. Right? You may have its matter, but you don't have its being because you don't have its form. Or you may have the agent that's going to produce it, but you don't have the being of the thing because the agent has not yet given the form. The agent which gives the esse has to give the form as well. And that's why Thomas says God has to be the cause of all the forms because he is cause of esse. He causes it through the forms. So form is cause of esse. Now that might sound as though form is more important than esse after all.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
But there are different kinds of causality. Form is not the agent of esse. It's not the agent cause. Okay? Because an agent is already in act and it produces another act. Okay? It's not as though the form is already in act and produces the esse of the thing. Okay? That's not how it works. But the form is cause as the immediate potency for the esse. Okay? It's caused precisely in the way that potency is a cause of act. Right? You know, that's how Aristotle defines potency as principle of act. Right? But it's inferior. It's inferior to the act. It's lower because it's only potency. And that's why the form can't be the only cause. There has to be a higher cause who is in act, an agent who gives esse through the form.
Okay.
But if you separate the form and the esse, everything collapses. You haven't understood anything. So this is a way of supporting the idea that you could say that form is the final cause. That esse is the final cause of form. Form is for the sake of esse, and the esse of the thing is the goodness of the thing. Thomas will say that. Esse is what makes a thing good is its esse, its actuality. Right? So it's the final, but not the principle.
May I ask you just, let's say, for my information, but also for the viewers, we could not say, or you don't say that. You say that form is here the cause of esse, somehow this potential principle of esse. Maybe we could say also the formal cause, probably.
Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely, yes. Okay.
Yes, good.
But could we? But we cannot say. I have the impression that we cannot say that this is the same as essence.
Well, it is in things that are pure forms.
Okay.
The essence of for a material thing, the essence is a composite of matter and form. Right?
Composite. Okay.
But it's primarily the form. Even in material things, the essence is chiefly the form.
Chiefly the form. Okay.
That's the formal principle. The matter is potency for form, right? Okay. And then the composite of matter and form are the. Okay. Those are the principles of the essence, and those. And Thomas says, in the commentary on the Metaphysics in Book 4, when Aristotle starts talking about the meaning of ens and unum and all, Thomas says ens refers to esse, which is the actus essendi. He says actus essendi there. Okay. So he's talking about actus essendi, and he says that is always constituted per principia essentia. It's constituted through the principles of the essence of the thing, through the matter, and I think he means the matter and the form, right? Okay. And chiefly the form, because the matter doesn't give esse except through the form, right? The form brings the esse with it. Right? Okay. Okay. So okay. Thomas will many times he will say, form gives being to matter.
Okay.
This Father Duan would stress that very much.
Yeah, I think this is very clear, but I would add here an aspect that seems to me quite important. We've discussed it in our correspondence. Let's say that this accent on the form is foreign, is alien to the existential interpretation of Thomism, because yes. the one was somehow in this text that stress the form was somehow critical of Gilson and of Owens.
Who were his teachers? You know, they were his teachers.
Yeah.
But he criticized them, yeah.
And so if we take this existential standard, that it's a standard interpretation. It's quite a standard interpretation in the last time, because we were talking before about this Neoplatonic interpretation, but the Neoplatonic interpretation is basically let's say an upgraded form of this existential interpretation.
Yes, I think that's true.
Is it true? Because if we at the beginning, let's say, of this type of interpretation of St. Thomas, there was this Gilsonian interpretation that was Gilson thought that St. Thomas was that esse in St. Thomas was an original discovery of him. But then came Pierre Hadot and the authors that you mentioned, and they said no, we can find this already in this palimpsest about Porphyry and so on. So it's basically the same interpretation, and so let's say that we are dealing here basically with this existential interpretation of St. Thomas. So what in which part of your let's say or of the one's interpretation about this centrality of form in being, with which part of this exposition Gilson or Owens would disagree?
That's a good question.
Would they disagree?
Oh, I think they would disagree very strongly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. Yes. because they really they want to make the essay of a thing really the principle of all the reality of the thing. Okay, and they will grant. I find it difficult now to explain their viewpoint because I don't think it makes much sense, but I'll try.
Yeah.
That the thing essay is the first effect in a thing is in a caused thing in a creature is its essay, and the essay somehow causes the formal causality of the form. It causes, so somehow first you get essay and then the form comes to limit it and contract it. Okay, I think this is the main point that of disagreement, and it's also true with Fabro, right, who has the more
Yeah.
Neoplatonic reading of it, but that form is understood in a very negative way. It's understood merely as a limiting factor, right, on essay. Essay by itself would be infinite, indeterminate, right, and and then form comes to limit it in some way or another and define it, and so essences come to have a kind of a negative function, right? And that's kind of true in Gilson. It's even stronger in Owens, I think, the negative character. And then you find others who go even farther, like Norris Clark, who essence and form are just negative things, you know. And it's
So they are.
reality is all essay. It's all essay.
So, but this means that essay is somehow, let's say, in their worldview, is somehow. I'm interested in your opinion. Is somehow self-contracting, you know, self-limiting, or is just or maybe that essay is since is created and is finite and therefore somehow limited, and we call this limitedness um, form or essence.
Yeah, it's something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
I suppose they would trace it. You know, another very important book here, I would say another very important author, I found him helpful on this sort of question, how they understand this situation, is Rudy Tevelde. Do you
Yeah.
know him? He's a Dutch scholar. He has a book called Participation and Substantiality in Thomas Aquinas. He was a student of Jan Ertzen. Okay? And his English is wonderful. He's a wonderful writer, very, very clear, right? And he talks more about Fabro than about Gilson, but he talks about how in Fabro you have a kind of a double participation, right? You have a participation in essay, right? But then somehow God conceives different things, and he conceives them by conceiving these limiting principles, which are the forms, right? And he composes the essay with the limiting principle to create the different things. Okay? But there's kind of these two factors which are not intrinsically connected. Okay? They're almost in tension with each other because the essay kind of wants to be infinite, but it's kind of limited by the form that receives. And it's true. Thomas will say that potency limits act, and the recipient always limits what it receives. You know, unreceived act is infinite, right? And it's only limited by the potency that receives it. So it's true that created essences and created forms limit the essay that they receive. But that's not their only function. That's not their main function, I think, and that's not why they are called essences. Okay? It's not why they are called forms or essences. They are very positive. They're perfections. Thomas calls them perfections. They are perfections. Yeah.
That somehow enable essay to actualize itself somehow and
Yeah. Now this is. I wish Thomas were more explicit about how that works. He has a couple of texts which to me suggests that the idea is that the function, especially of the form, right, is to complete the unity of a thing. In one place, Thomas says that the essence of a thing already has unity, right, which is a negative thing, undivision, lack of division, right? It's a negative concept, so it doesn't already imply any perfection, right? And the essence is already one, and then the essay actualizes that. So my thought is that matter by itself is not yet one. It's only potentially one. Matter can be one or many. The matter in an elephant, you can divide up the matter, right? If you kill the elephant and you divide it up. Right? So matter is potentially one or many, right? But when it receives a form, it becomes determinately one. And when you have the unity, immediately the essay is received. And that's, you can only understand that from God as coming from God, giving the essay. But the essay presupposes the unity of the thing. This is my interpretation. Right? I'm not sure, but to me, it kind of makes sense, right? That you have the identity, the unity, which is identity. Aristotle says that identity means substantial unity, the unity of a single substance. Right? So you have the identity, and once you have the identity of the thing established, then it immediately its essay is received in it. There's no obstacle to its essay anymore, and it exists, and it's in act, and that's the actuality of its identity.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. These are some core explanations, I think, to understand your point of view. That we share much at our YouTube channel. We are also all here Aristotelian Thomists.
Good.
We are fans of this kind of Thomism. Well, Steve, if we move a little bit to one more question that you also deal quite a lot in the book here is very, very important in understanding the metaphysics in general and metaphysics of St. Thomas in particular, is the question of the subject matter of metaphysics. It's a classical question. Authors disagree here. You have the idea that subject matter of metaphysics is God or the separate substances, or being common to God and separate substances, or substance in general, or being in general. You have very different interpretations. What's your take on this question?
Well, you're right. This is very important. There's a lot of disagreement. It's a very difficult question. I think, as regards Aristotle, I think there will always be disagreement. Right? Right? The text, as you know, the text of the Metaphysics, it's a complicated piece of work, right? And it's put together. It's very hard to say. You can find arguments for all of those positions, I think, in Aristotle. But I think Thomas is very clear, right? He is very clear, even in his premium of the commentary on the Metaphysics, that the subject matter of metaphysics is not the highest causes, right? Okay. Which some people say, it's not the separate substances, right? That's Averroes who held that. Right? And it's not God. God is not the subject of metaphysics. He's very clear. God is the subject of sacred doctrine, of theology, right? Yeah. That's a different science, right? So the subject is being, is ends, right? Not essay. We've been using the word being to translate essay. He doesn't say essay, it's ends. This is a problem. This is always a problem in English. The words to use for essay and ends. This is always a problem.
Also in Slovene.
Really? Yeah, it's very frustrating, isn't it? So the subject is being, and God is not the subject. He's cause of the subject. Right? and we try to reach God as in metaphysics as in order to understand being, to explain being by reference to its highest cause, right? But I would say for Thomas, and I think most Thomists I think would agree with this. I think that when we say it's ens commune, right, common being, it's that doesn't include God, right?
That
That's
does
not
not include.
does not include God.
Does
God,
not include.
it's not sort of an umbrella that covers God and creatures.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Right? It's common esse or common ends, and you could also speak of common esse, is
Okay.
is belongs to creatures, and God is outside of that. He's the cause of
Okay.
and this connects with what we were talking about before, right? God is cause of the whole nature of being, right?
Okay.
Right? And of course, you know, we say that God is a being, so it sounds as though he's under the concept of being as well, right? That's the problem, right? And Thomas will say the Neoplatonists don't like to say that God is an ens, and they'll only say he's esse. Thomas is happy to call God ens, right? And of course, he's not a he doesn't participate in esse, right? The way all creatures do. Mm. If you thought that God is nothing but esse, right? As we were talking about that before, right? If you thought that, then I think he would fall under this concept. He would be the highest, the primary ends, right? But he would still fall under the concept of ends as its primary instance, I think. Okay? He would just be kind of the pure nature of esse, the pure nature of being. But he's not. He's the cause of the nature of being, right? And how can we see that? And this is what I think is not stressed enough in St. Thomas, and this goes back to the mystery of God, that all of these names that we give to God, you know, like wisdom, we say that God is wise, he has wisdom, he's powerful, he has power, he's loving, he has love, he's a being, he has esse, and he is his esse, and he is his love, and he is his power. Okay. But if we really stress, and what Thomas stresses is the simplicity of God, right? And on this, there's a disagreement between Thomas and the Scotus, right? But if we stress the simplicity of God, then it turns out that the esse of God is not just esse, it's also wisdom, right? And it's also power, right? It kind of breaks out of the concept of esse, right? So we shouldn't think of esse as a principle that God shares in, right, somehow, or that is God is under, or that is a component of God, right? Or that is simpler than God, right? Esse is simpler than any creature, but somehow God contains esse and power and love and everything else in a simple form, which is really the cause of all those other things. And it's higher than all, it's the source of esse and the source of power, the source of goodness, right? And the source of horses and of elephants and of you and of me, right? And that's why you can't put him under the concept of this. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was just wondering. I mean, when you say that being is the subject matter of metaphysics, is this being include actual being and being in potency, or no?
Well, it's primarily actual being. Thomas says that being in the proper sense signifies something in act, right?
Yeah.
So potency is an extended sense, right? But it is a sense of being, of real being, because the real being is the being of the categories,
Yeah.
and that's divided into potency and act. But it's analogous, of course. It's primarily being in act, and only secondarily being in potency. right?
And,
So, yeah.
yes, okay. But what would you say about this opinion that and that is quite, let's say, explicitly mm, explained in metaphysics in Aristotle, that the primary meaning of being is substance. We have
Well, Thomas,
spoken about, yeah.
uh-huh.
We've
Thomas agrees
spoken
with
about
that.
form, about essence, but let we speak also about substance.
Right. Okay, good. That's good. Yeah. Well, Thomas agrees with that. And he even says that substance is not the whole subject of metaphysics, but it's the principal part of the subject. So it's only a part of the subject, but it's the main part, right?
Mhm,
The other
mhm,
part is accidents, right, which are quite secondary, right? But they do add something to substance. Accidents really add something, so that substances are not fully good and fully perfect without their accidents. But a
mhm,
substance is a being in the primary sense because only substances can be fully, only substances have their own being, okay? And they don't share in the being of something else,
okay.
right? And the being of an accident is nothing but it's making a substance be somehow.
Mhm,
So whereas you don't have to refer to accidents when you think of substances, they're kind of self-contained. So
mhm,
Thomas says in the Metaphysics commentary that substance has a firm and solid essay so that it
mhm,
is subsists in its own right. So it's the primary subject of essay. Right? And that's what an ends means, Thomas. It always means a subject, but the
mhm.
primary subject is substance,
Yeah, yeah. Steve,
which then is constituted by matter and form, but those are the principles of the substance. That's
mhm.
yeah. Sorry.
Since we were speaking about God, I would put maybe here the question about the five ways we were discussing before. The question about the five ways, the quinque vie,
Hmm.
that have in your opinion, an important Aristotelian aspect, let's say. Hmm? The
Yes.
quinque vie, the five ways, are definitely the most famous part of, in a popular way, the most famous part of the philosophy or theology, let's say philosophy of St.
Yeah.
Thomas Aquinas, the metaphysics
Yes,
of
I
St. Thomas
suppose so.
Aquinas.
Sure. I think that's
Yeah.
right. Right.
And what's your take? What's the Aristotelian take, let's say, on the five ways?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I think to answer that, I need to say something about how I read the five ways in the Summa.
Yeah.
As you know, they're very short. They're very compressed, right?
Mhm.
Very brief, and surprisingly so. And people are often frustrated by how brief they are because they raise so many questions that he does not answer there.
Mhm.
You know, um, but my personal opinion is that the Summa is a work of theology. Right? It's the science of theology whose subject, as we said before, the subject is God. And
Okay.
Thomas agrees with Aristotle that no science proves the existence of its own subject. Okay? It takes its subject for granted. It either gets it from another science, or it
Mhm.
knows it by experience, or maybe by faith, or whatever. Okay? But it doesn't prove it. So why does he even have these proofs in the Summa? Right? I think we have to ask that. And I think, well, he's reminding us, right,
Mm.
of proofs that we should already know,
Okay.
because he's assuming that his reader has already done a full curriculum of philosophy. Right?
Mhm.
Theology was studied after philosophy, and you had to
Mhm.
go through a whole curriculum and study all the parts of philosophy before you began. As you know, the Summa is for beginners in theology. Well, it's not. It's certainly not a catechism. Right? It's not a catechism.
Okay.
It's for
Mhm.
those who've already done a lot of philosophy. So it's very sophisticated, right? But now they're beginning the study. So I think he's reminding us of things that he thinks we've already studied in a more thorough and more complete way.
Mhm.
And I find confirmation of that idea in the fact that if you look at his commentaries on Aristotle, you find all the 5 ways, okay,
Oh.
worked out in much more detail, right, than in the Summa, right? But it's all in the commentaries on Aristotle. So the first way, as you know, it's in book 8 of the Physics, and also book 12 of the Metaphysics. You know, from the motion of things, you know, you get the unmoved mover, right? The second way, the order of efficient causes, which can't go to infinity. There has to be a first efficient cause. Well, that's book 2 of the Metaphysics. All the causes have to have a first. They can't go to infinity. Right?
Okay.
The third way, very important, and this is not generally recognized, I think. Now a few scholars recognize it. You have to look at the commentary on the De Caelo of Aristotle, right? The treatment of contingent and necessary beings, okay? That's really fundamental for the third way, and especially the concept, which is very Aristotelian, and we've lost it, is the concept of natural necessity as opposed to logical necessity. People read the third way and they think he's talking, when he talks about necessary beings, he's talking about logically necessary beings. He's not. He's talking about natural necessity, which is a different, and that's very Aristotelian. That concept. The fourth way, again, is he gets his inspiration. In the fourth way, he cites Aristotle twice. He refers to Aristotle explicitly, and again to book 2 of the Metaphysics, that what's first in truth is also first in being, and what's first is the cause of all the others in the genus. That's fire is the cause of everything hot. Well, that's just book 2 of the Metaphysics. And then in the fifth way, you know, the government of things and how natural things without intellect, without cognition, tend toward the good. Well, that's very explicit in book 2 of the Physics, in Thomas's commentary. And he has a long excursus in his commentary about how teleology in nature demonstrates divine providence. Right? So I think all of his inspiration for all of this is quite clearly in the works of Aristotle. Right? Now I'm going against the trend. There's a trend now. Not all the interpreters do this, but you know, people are so taken by the distinction between essence and esse, right? And the real distinction. And you know, as you know, in the little work on being and essence, he talks about that distinction, and then he insists, well, there has to be one reality in which that distinction doesn't hold, and that's God. Okay? Well, but now there are interpreters who want to see all the 5 ways as kind of variations on that, and there's really only one proof. Right?
I'm one of them.
Are you one of them? Okay.
Yeah, I thought it is exactly this way.
Okay.
So
good.
Tell me your criticism.
Well, I just think Thomas has many ways. I think that's you can go that way if you want, and it's a very sophisticated way. It's a very difficult way, right? Plus, there are some problems with how to read the De Ente et Essentia. You know, it's a little bit too Avicennian, maybe for the later Thomas. That's maybe a minor point. That's a minor point. But I don't think you can spin out all of the 5 ways from that, and I don't think he wants to do that. I think he thinks the mind moves gradually toward metaphysical understanding of things. You know, I think you see that even in the 5 ways, that we start with motion, right? Which is, and he says it's very evident to the senses. And we're starting down here with the sensible things, and then we move up very, very high. Right? That we start down, and then the order of efficient causes. Well, we understand that that's very practical. You know, like the order in an army. You know, the general commands the captain, and the captain commands the sergeant. Right? So we can understand that order. And then necessary and contingent beings, right? Things that come into being and pass away, and necessary. So it becomes more and more metaphysical. Whereas the distinction between essence and esse, on my reading, is what we talked about before. It's a very subtle distinction, very subtle. Right? And it's not at all obvious. That's why my problem with the the deente, he makes it sound kind of easy, the distinction. And I think because he talks about we can understand what a thing is without understanding its essay. Right?
Yeah.
And that's too much of a logical matter, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Whereas the later Thomas, they're so closely related that if you think that the distinction between essence and essay is easy to understand, then you haven't understood it. It's not easy to understand at all. They're very close, right?
Okay.
That's my take. Then this is Father Duan's take on that too. Yeah, that was his. He insisted on that, and I've learned that from him. So I'm not saying that proof doesn't work. It's okay as a proof, but I don't think you can or should try to collapse all of the 5 ways into that. I think the 5 ways are kind of different windows onto God, right? Different paths to God, and we need all of them, right? They give us, and he uses one or another when he starts talking about the divine attributes, and we need them all. Right? We need many concepts. Right? We're not angels.
Steve, I also agree that it may exaggerate to say that all the 5 ways can be deducted from the proof from the syntax, especially the 4th and the 5th way seem to somehow transcend that frame. But I would ask you. I mean, we had also a discussion with my colleagues here at the channel. I would ask you many people see as one of the most difficult parts to understand in the first way, in the first of the proofs of St. Thomas in the Summa Theologiae, is the part when he says, okay, we have motion, we have a cause of motion. Nothing can be cause of its own motion.
Right.
And then he says, okay, we have a series of causes. One cause causes the motion of the other, and of the motion of the other, and so on. And then is the problem of the infinite regress of the possibility of the hypothesis of infinite regress of causes. And here, I absolutely, I had always the impression that he obviously presupposes an explanation that is given somewhere else, because it's not possible that such a thinker as Thomas can say just, well, this such a kind of infinite regress is simply odd. No, so what's your take? What's your explanation of this sentence?
Good. No, that's a very good question. This is very important, I think. Right. I would say 2 things. One is, as you know, we should set aside the question of the eternity of the world, or there being a beginning in time. That's not the point, right? As you know, because Aristotle thought the world had no beginning, right? And yet there has to be a first mover. So it's not first in time. There doesn't have to be a first motion in time. But if you think of sort of the circular motion of Aristotle, you have an inner mover and an outer mover, and then you come to the top, and there's the outermost cause of all the things going on inside. Okay, so that's clear. Okay, but you're right. I think you are right. It sounds as though Thomas says, well, you can have a series of moved movers, right? You can have, the rock, which is moved by the stick, and the stick is moved by your arm, and your arm is moved by your will, and your will is moved by the commander, or whatever, right? But he says that can't go to infinity, because then there would be no first.
Okay.
And you say, well, but that's what we're trying to prove, a first, right? So it sounds like he's begging the question, right? Doesn't it? Right? And that's kind of your complaint. Why do we need a first? That's the whole question. Okay? Well, he's not trying to prove simply that there's a first. He's trying to prove there's a first unmoved mover. So you need the first part of what you said, that nothing moves itself. If something could move itself, then the first mover could be a self mover. Okay? and it wouldn't be totally unmoved, and that would mess up everything, right? That would be much easier to understand, right? An unmoved mover is much more difficult to understand and much more of a mystery. But I think what's really key here, and this goes back again to the second book of the Metaphysics, right? When he says a first mover, what does he mean, right? Well, he doesn't simply mean a mover that all the other movers come after, right? Number one in the series, right? That's not all that he means. In fact, I would not translate it, primum movens. I wouldn't translate it first. I would translate it primary. You need a primary mover, right? What is that? Well, a primary, it's like the way substance is primary being, right? A primary mover is something which is a mover in virtue of itself. It doesn't depend on something else for moving. It moves in virtue. It's a mover in virtue of itself. Okay? It has that attribute primo et per se. That's Thomas's expression. It's what's primarily, like fire is what is primarily hot, right? And water is what is primarily wet. So you need something which is a prime. All the other movers, the moved movers, don't move in virtue of themselves. They only move in virtue of being moved by something else. Okay. So I think he's saying that if we have an infinite series of those, then all of the movers are things that only move in virtue of something else, which is to say, in themselves, if we look at them just in themselves, they are only movers in potency. They aren't movers in act. They have to be actualized by something else. But if all the movers are only movers in potency, then there won't be any movement.
There wouldn't be any act.
There would be no act. That's right. You need something which is in act in virtue of itself and is able to actualize other things in virtue of itself. Because the moved movers are not really the movers. This is what helps a lot, I think, in book 2 of the Metaphysics, that he spells it out more. Aristotle says, really, the real cause is the primary thing. That's the cause. The others are, you can have other secondary causes, but those aren't really the cause. The cause is the primary thing, right? You know what I mean? See what I mean?
Yeah, but here, Steve, here I see the connection with the ente, because here, if I remember it well, in that text, you also need, a being that has esse in his essence. So,
oh yes, that's true. Yes.
And otherwise, there wouldn't be no esse.
No, that's right. That's absolutely right. I agree with that. I agree with that.
It's quite similar for the for the first way and for the second way.
No, you're right. That's right. Yeah. Yes. Otherwise, you would have an infinite regress of beings and no first being.
And no act, no existence.
No act. No, that's right. No, you're absolutely right. I agree with that.
It's like I read in your book here that it's like to have repeaters, TV repeaters without a transmittant, no?
Yes, exactly.
Without a broadcasting station.
Yes.
You just have, let's say, empty screens, because there will be no broadcasting.
That's right. You only have transmitters and you have no source. Well, there's nothing there, right? That's right. No, I agree with that reading of the Dante. I think that's right. And you would have no essay. My only point about the Dante is that the starting point, the distinction between essence and essay, is so subtle. The starting point of motion is very clear, right? Motion is obvious, right? And you go from potency, what is only in potency, to what is in act, right? And so that's much easier to understand. The distinction, but you're absolutely, the potency act distinction is really crucial. And that's in all of these proofs. You're absolutely right. But it's much easier to see in motion. Okay. That's all. Yeah.
I agree.
Okay.
Steve, we agreed for an hour and a half. We are somehow reaching this.
We're getting there.
this limit of maybe of attention of our viewers. I would discuss with you these things for many hours more. But I have a question here that is, I think, quite crucial. Not maybe so much in a philosophical sense, and this would be the last question somehow. Not so much in a philosophical sense, but let's say in a pastoral sense, yeah, maybe because all these topics we have discussed are Thomistic topics, Aristotelian topics that somehow presuppose, let's say, that presuppose a realistic approach. A realistic approach. We have a real being, we have substance, we have motion, we have something outside our minds, let's say so, an
Sure.
extramental being, uh, and we are going to analyze this. And we can say that this is physics, this is metaphysics, this is Aristotelianism, this is Thomism, and it works well. I think that many viewers can agree that it works well, at least.
Sure.
But we have we are living in the modern world. I'm not a
Yeah.
huge fan of the modern world, but we are living in the modern world, where Kant happened and Descartes happened and
Sure.
Hegel and all these kind of crazy people, that simply adopted a radically subjectivistic point of view, standpoint, a radically agnostic point of view that simply they do not acknowledge, they do not um, they do not agree with us that there is anything outside the mind, or at least that cannot know if there is
Yeah.
anything
Yeah.
outside the mind. You know,
Yeah.
and here, and my question is here. We have discussed it also before in our correspondence, but for the
Yes.
sake of presenting this problem, uh, how can we, in your opinion, how we should engage in dialogue, let's say, with the modern world,
Yeah.
with the modern thought, from this, let's say, system of thought that was presented in this our video.
Good. You're right. This is very important. And everyone seems to have this idea in their mind. Although I find that the young people now are a little bit impatient with it, that they
Hmm.
really want to know the reality, and they're kind of tired of subjectivism. They're not satisfied with being
Okay.
enclosed in their own minds. I find, right, a little bit, which is encouraging, right?
Uh,
But yeah, it's a very good question. We have discussed this before, right? And I remember you brought up, and I think you were right to bring up a passage in the Summa, it's in the section on the intellect, right? In question 85 of the first part, where Thomas talks about what he calls the intelligible species, right? The likenesses in our minds of the things that we know, right? We talked about that before when we talked about God, right? But
yeah,
he
yeah.
makes a very important point, and this is essential to his realism, right? Precisely, is that these likenesses in our minds are not the things that we know, right?
Hmm.
They're principles by which we know the external thing. So I'm not knowing my concept of a hippopotamus.
Hmm.
I'm knowing hippopotamuses, right? By way of my intelligible species. That's very important, right? Whereas you can almost say that the modern move, the Cartesian move, and the empiricists from a different point of view, what we primarily know are our own ideas or our own impressions or our own concepts, and then we try to figure out if they represent anything, right? And they're kind of stuck there. So how do you argue about this? That's your question, right? Right.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah, yeah. And I think you're right that Thomas. I'm not sure you can give it proof, right? In the strict sense of a demonstration, you know, that the one is wrong. But I think it's quite right, as I think you would want to do, to look at, Thomas refers to the book 4 of the Metaphysics in that passage. And he says that the people who hold that point of view, if you say that what we know are our own ideas or our own impressions, then you're basically saying that everything is true, right? You have, and that's what people will say. You have your truth, and I have mine, right? And everything what turns out to be true. Book 4 is about those who deny the principle of non-contradiction. You know, if the principle of non-contradiction doesn't hold, then all thoughts are true. Contradictory thoughts are both true, right? Now, these people aren't, that's a little bit different from the subjectivist. The subjectivist might agree that you can't hold contradictions, right? In your own mind, in your own mind. He might agree with that, but he's still thinking, well, you know your truth and you have your ideas and I have mine, and yours are true for you and mine are true for me, okay? And the truth is just the intellect is sort of satisfied with those things. Your intellect is satisfied with your ideas and mine is satisfied with my ideas, and that's about all you can say. Well, you know, Aristotle doesn't say that he can refute the person who denies the principle of non-contradiction. And in fact, he doesn't say, well, I can make him contradict himself, because the guy doesn't care if he contradicts himself. He doesn't care, right? That's not a problem for him. But Aristotle says, look, if he says that, then if he says a single word, right? Well, by his own admission, that word can mean both one thing and the negation of that thing. So man, if you say the word man, it means both man and not man, right? Right. In which case it means nothing at all, right? And in which case you really haven't said anything. And Aristotle says, and you're like a vegetable, right? These people are like vegetables, right? It's very funny, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think you could say something similar about the subjectivist. If you're talking about your ideas and I'm talking about my ideas, then we can never disagree or agree about anything because we're never talking about the same thing, right? And so precisely what you can't have is dialogue. Dialogue is impossible because you're talking about your stuff and I'm talking about mine. So there is no dialogue, and they should not talk to anybody else. They're talking to themselves, right? So it's kind of like what Aristotle says. That there's no point in talking to each other.
Steve, I don't know if it's also your experience, but this is exactly what is happening in the modern world, in today's world, because simply I have the impression that someone who holds such a radical understanding, but it's quite common today. It's quite common today. They simply are not interested in any kind of dialogue. Also, they maybe use the word dialogue as a banner, you know, political.
Yeah. But it's not really dialogue. Yeah.
It's not really dialogue, no. But yeah.
No, that's true. That's very true. And so it becomes simply a matter of just movements in the game of power, right? And and not dialogue. And there, I don't think what you need then is not a proof. You need other means of showing of attracting people to the life of the intellect, to the life of the pursuit of truth, right? And the attraction of living a human life of dialogue and exchange of thoughts, right? And people maybe just don't have that experience, you know. I think if they had the experience of it, they would find it attractive, you know. They would be taken by it. So you're right. This is a serious pastoral issue. There's no question about that. That's right.
But on the other hand, I think that they still hold, you know, dialogue as a banner.
Yes.
You know, as a let's say in this demonstrative way, in the sense that we'd like to that we are tolerating each other. We like to understand you and to speak with you and to sit in a circle and discuss. So there is this still, you know, the human being is still a rational animal.
Yes, exactly. You can't quite get rid of it completely. That's true.
You know,
that's a good point.
And maybe this is the point that also Aristotle makes regarding the plant or the vegetable. You know, that is worth of talking. No one wants to be a vegetable.
Right. That's
you
right.
know?
That's
and
right.
so this is, I think that this is one point that can be stressed in this dialogue with
I think that's a very good point. Yes, I think that's excellent. Yeah.
This is one thing. The other thing is, I agree. The subjectivist is not really or not necessarily, or not let's say constantly, someone who denies the principle of non-contradiction. You can have a radical subjectivist thinker like, let's say, Kant, who is not willing of giving away the principle of non-contradiction.
Right.
And with this kind of people, if this kind of people is concerned, maybe the arguments from the question 85, Article 2 of the first part of the Summa can work well, because St. Thomas says there precisely this, that if our, as you summarized before, if the primary object of my thought is my thought itself, then everything is true, because my thought is always, let's say, adequate, always corresponds with the object,
with itself.
With itself. It is itself. And but then also contradictory truths, contradictory sentences has to be all true. Everything has to be true, and so the principle of non-contradiction is denied.
They have to, if they want to engage in, if they think they're really dialoguing. So you think black and I think white. You think the world is black and I think the world is white. Well, if those are both true and we're talking about the same thing, then that is denying the principle of non-contradiction. That's right. So that's right. So they have to give up something there. They have to give up something.
This is the kind of thoughts that bring me some courage, let's say, in the dialogue with modern people.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a very deep instinct to want to be rational, right?
Yeah.
That's very deep, and you can't get rid of that. And we should hang on to that and cultivate that as best we can. Yes.
Yeah.
That's very true. I think that's good.
Steve, 1 hour and a half of our discussion is somehow behind us.
Yes.
So we'll come slowly to the final remarks.
Okay.
I'll give you some time for your final remark. I'll make my small final remark here. Okay. So the last word will be yours.
I don't know. I have no last words, but anyway, you go ahead.
I just make an ending at the very end of the show. So I think that this was really a very informative discussion. I think that anyone who is interested in Thomism can was enjoying it, because of all the topics that we touched. If we I can make a summary for my part. It was this was very interesting to me, this connection of the 5 ways with these passages from Metaphysics from Aristotle, so that we can see where are the presuppositions of the 5 ways that seems to miss in the text of the Summa. And all this discussion of form and being, and how also this transcendence of God and the knowledge of God can be safeguarded by the stress of on the essence in God. This was all to me quite new, I must admit. But we discussed a lot of things in our correspondence, but these topics were somehow new to me, and I'm really grateful, Steve, for this, for all this, your thoughts and answers, and for all your work for in the this interpretation and of St. Thomas's thought that is so important, that was so much stressed, the importance of Thomism by so many popes, and I think that this work is really important. So I'm really grateful for this discussion. So this was my final remark.
Okay.
The word is yours.
Well, I have no grand finale as a statement, but I just thank you for this opportunity to talk, and it's been a real pleasure. It's been a really pleasant conversation, and I think you're doing wonderful things to promote Thomism there. I'll have to learn Slovene now so that I can follow your podcast. Unfortunately, I don't know too well, but I think it's really great what you're doing, and I think we just have to help do what we can to help people. Maybe St. Thomas isn't the first thing that people should study. He's difficult, as we were saying before. He's difficult. He can be kind of dry. He's not very funny, right? He's not very amusing. But if we can lead them into it, I think that many people can find the attraction of it. Just, the clarity of his thought, the rationality of his thought, and the humility of his thought. He's very humble in a striking way, too. So keep up the great work. I think that's my final word for our conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you again. I hope that there will be other opportunities to discuss similar topics, maybe also more specific topics. We've discussed this before. So
it would be great.
Thank you. I would like to thank also the viewers for the attention, and say maybe just some words in Slovene for the ending. Torej, hvala lepa vsem, ki ste sledili. Bilo je v angleščini. Upam, da nam bo uspelo tudi podnapise napisati, tako da mislim, da ste opazili, da smo imeli opravka tukaj z nekom, ki se res pozna na svetega Tomaža Akvinskega, tako da kdorkoli se približno zanima za svetega Tomaža Akvinskega v slovenščini, je res vabljen, da si ta video ogleda in da uživa ob njem, tako kot sem užival jaz, ko sem ga tukaj pogovarjal. So I made a short reflection on our discussion.
Okay, great. Wonderful.
Steve.
Okay.
Thank you. Goodbye and
thank
God
you.
bless.
Okay, God bless. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.